Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, and today I wanted to make a video looking back at my predictions for which specs were going to be good in Raid this patch, and then seeing how well I did. So quick caveat, this list was made before the Hunter buffs and before the Shadow Priest nerfs that came out, so there are some predictions here that are still a bit off, but I'll take a little bit of credit on those ones. Let's start off with the healers, though, because I know some of you only watch these videos for a couple minutes, and the healers are where I did best, so I figured I'd leave you with the impression that I was pretty good at this stuff if you're going to stop the video early. Okay, so healers, I had Disc and Holy Paladin in S tier, then I had Resto Shaman in A, and I put the others down between B and C. Here I think I did really well. If you look at Sylvanas comps, the top 5 guilds that killed it, 10 Holy Paladins, 9 Disciplined Priests, 1 Resto Shaman, and no other healer specs represented. If anything, this is a spot where like an S plus tier for Disc Priest and Holy Paladin, because the gap is just that wide. I can't believe we went into this expansion, right? And they looked at how the healer meta was in BFA, and they were like, all right, you know what we need to do? We need to give Priest power infusion, and we need to give Holy Paladins Ashen Hallow. That's what the healer balance needs. What a wild time to be alive for the healing role. So there, I think I did pretty well. Let's go on to ranged. Ranged, I had Moonkin and Shadow in S tier. Now, Shadow did get nerfed after this video came out. It got a small nerf, and it wasn't particularly played among the top guilds either. Among the 5 first guilds to kill the boss, looks like 3 of them ran Shadow Priest, and each of those guilds only ran 1 Shadow Priest. So not really an S tier performance coming out of Shadow. My suspicion is that Shadow probably should have been put in A tier at the time of this video, and the nerfs probably brought it down to B or A minus, something like that. Definitely still not a bad spec. My guild played 2 on our Sylvanas kill, and it was fine, but not insane. Moonkin, I'm pretty happy about up in A or up in S. There, the guilds averaged 4. Yeah, basically every single guild that killed this in the top 5 had 4 Moonkin in their roster. So 20 Moonkins in the world top 5. Of the 100 raiders in the world top 5, 20 of them were Moonkin. Definitely an S tier kind of performance out of the spec. Tremendous amounts of damage. Even, 2 different covenants there. Some are playing the Venthyr for more damage. Some are playing the Night Fae for reliability, survivability, and easier, more consistent gameplay. So that was the range that I put in S tier. Other than that, the other spots where I put ranged, I had Frost and Arcane up in A, and I had Fire in B. If anything, I think I probably should have Fire up in A. All 3 mage specs were good this tier. All 3 saw kills on Sylvanas fairly quick. I actually don't know when the first Fire Sylv kill was. Of the mages that killed it first in the top 5, we had 4 Arcane and 1 Frost, it looks like. But Fire mages are now showing up on kills for Sylv, and they're looking fantastic on damage there as well. All 3 mage specs looking really good overall for the raid. So, yeah, the rumors of Fire's death were definitely overrated. I think I overrated those rumors here. Although, looking just at the top 5, it definitely hadn't shown up yet. Other range specs, I had Elemental Shaman up in A. This probably should have been down in B. It wasn't a bad spec, but it wasn't hugely represented. Hunters, so I put Marksmanship in B, and then I put Beast Mastery down in C. The Hunter buffs, I think, shifted those both up probably by 1 tier, bringing Hunter up into A. I mean, Hunter was doing a lot of damage, but if you looked at kills, or at guilds like progression attempts, Hunters just die in a way that other specs don't due to the inherent fragile nature of their spec. If somebody is bleeding out in your raid, there's a very good chance it is the Hunter. And so for that reason, even though they did as much damage as they did, guilds were playing 1. Which, actually, I guess, okay, so Method and World 5th played 2, but every other top 5 guild played 1. And, yeah, so maybe low A, high B for that kind of performance. Other range specs, did I miss any? No, looks like I got most of them. Okay, let's move on to melee damage dealers. So I had no melee up in S. I had Havoc and Arms, which were the 2... stacked, like the 2 melee that you saw guilds play multiple of were Havoc and Arms, mostly Arms. Arms was more stacked than Havoc, but guilds were playing, some guilds in the top 5 played multiple of each. I had them both in A. I'm pretty happy about the placement of arms up in A. A lot of people miss that. A lot of tier lists had arms down in like C. Pretty good looking, I think, there. Where I missed was the enhancement shaman that works really well with both of them. I have down in C. Clearly better than that. As most top guilds were playing one, this should have also been up in A. And if anything, maybe arms should have been up in S, honestly. This thing is so much damage. Fury I had an A. Fury could have been good this tier. The thing about Fury is that it was not happy with Sylvanas dying at 50% or 45%, right? That was bad news for the spec, and that was what led to arms being the spec that saw a lot of play. But, you know, if Sylvanas had died at 0, I think there's a good shot you'd have seen quite a bit more Fury. Other DPS melee specs, I'm pretty happy that I didn't put any of the others. I guess I put Ret up in A. This should have been in B. I think there were a couple of Rets. Actually, I don't even know if there were any Rets in the top 5. No, looks like there may not have been. Okay, yeah, so this should have been lower. Ret should have been down lower. My guild played one. It was fine, but definitely not insane. Unholy should have been higher, probably. A lot of guilds were playing one Unholy. The AMZ got nerfed a lot early in the patch cycle, and then it kind of got quietly buffed back up a little bit to be a little bit less bad. And now it's in a spot where DPS Death Knight's AMZ, it still works, it still does a lot of good stuff, and also their damage is just quite strong. So a lot of guilds were playing Death Knights. It was mostly the guilds that, like, had a good Death Knight on their roster. It's like Nagi from Echo, you know, rather than swapping him onto some alt, Cruella from Method, rather than swapping her onto some alt, those players were just staying on their Unholy Death Knights, which they're very good at, right? But the guilds that had 4 Unholies back in Castle Nathria, and none of them were like Unholy mains, right? They were all people flexing onto Unholy, largely flexed back off of it this tier. Frost, B, probably a fine place to land Frost to Death Knight. Rogue specs, so I put Outlaw and Assassination in B, and Subtlety in C. Subtlety probably shouldn't have been in C. Subtlety probably should have been at equal or above Assassination. If you actually look at the rogue specs that were used in most of the raid, Subtlety saw a lot of play in the earlier bosses, but by the time you get to Sylv, it actually is the Assassination that largely starts taking those spots. And so of the rogues in the world top 5, there are 2 of them, and they were both playing Assassination. A couple of Subtlety rogues have since killed the boss, but it is mainly Assassination they go for on that fight. You know, it's nice just to have your bleeds ticking while you're running out for Veil of Darkness or whatever. And so that, I think probably Assassination should have been, high B or low A. Outlaw, probably down to C. Although, you know, Outlaw is this kind of spec that it can look really good on certain damage profiles of fights. And this tier didn't really have those in ways that were important, right? Like Kel'Thuzad, you weren't really just like focusing cleave damage on a bunch of targets that were, important and dying quickly, and also trying to cleave the boss and, doing sustained damage the whole time. Instead, you were doing this kind of start-stop DPS thing, which wasn't what I was expecting from the PTR testing of that boss. And I think there's a version of Kel'Thuzad where Outlaw would have held its weight reasonably well, but never came to pass. The version of that fight that we actually fought was very different and rewarded very different things because of the way that you just stop DPS and wait for cooldowns. Anytime you're stopping DPS and waiting for cooldowns, spec like Outlaw are like, man, what am I doing here? Windwalker I had in B. High B or low A was probably better for this. For much of the raid, this spec was looking really good. For Sylv, it actually was not fantastic. Of guilds that had, a lot of guilds had Windwalker mains in for most of progression, but both Limit and Echo lobbed their Windwalker on Sylvanas due to just single target damage being very low on the boss in phases 2 and 3. They do a really good job of shredding ads when important, and there is some of that on Sylvanas, but turns out that that's not the resource you're most limited on. However, Pieces and BDG both played their Windwalkers and got good results out of them on Sylvanas. A lot of guilds have, and they've looked fine. So, yeah, high B or low A. Probably should have been low A with the way that I'd been tiering the other specs. And then down in C, the Survival and the Feral Druids. Yeah, that's... You know, Feral, it actually pipes on single target. Feral, if you were just, like, fighting a training dummy, Feral is going to be near the top of the meters on that. They do really, really high single target, but they don't really bring anything else to the table, which means that really high-end guilds that are considering their comp usually choose to leave it on the bench. But their single target is actually pretty phenomenal this tier. This is another one where if you looked at like, man, if you looked at like Balance and Feral coming into this expansion, right? Back in BFA, it's like, okay, Balance has Innervate, you know, it has trees, it has these things going for it, right? And Feral has Stampeding Roar, right? And what do they do going into this expansion? They were like, all right, you know what? Feral doesn't get Stampeding Roar anymore. Now all the Druid specs get that. That's no longer something that Feral brings, but stuff like Innervate and trees and stuff are still just Boomkin exclusive effects. So that is another thing that kind of along the veins of giving Disc Priest PI and giving Paladin Ash and Hallow is just like the balance did not need this expansion. Okay, last but not least, the tank situation. Here again, I think I did fairly well. I described all tanks as being pretty good, and they are for most guilds doing the raid. However, for the ultra top end, there's a clear winner, and it was the spec that I put in B tier, where I put the rest of the tanks up in A. So Prot Paladin just deals so much damage, and it turns out that this tier is about dealing damage and not about being tanky as a tank. There are no fights that are really slapping you around where tank deaths are just gonna rack up on you and gonna stop progression in a huge way. In a way that, like, you know, Sire Denathrius, for instance, if you looked at guild's progression on Sire, the question is, like, hey, are you losing 10 pulls to tank deaths or 20, right? And I figured that Prot Paladin would be a spec that landed closer to 20, whereas these others would land closer to 10. Turns out Sylvanas isn't like that at all. Sylvanas is instead about, okay, is your tank dealing 6,000 DPS, or are they dealing 3,000 DPS? And Prot Paladin is the way to deal 6,000 DPS. So that spec is the only constant between the World Top 5. Every guild played a Prot Paladin. The other slot alternated between a Brewmaster and a Blood Death Knight, where the Brewmaster was in the guilds that didn't have a Windwalker, and the Blood Death Knight was in the guilds that did. The other tank specs, though, saw a lot of use. If you extend down to the World Top 10, you start to see almost all of them. Guardian probably should have been down in B, although there were some Guardians that killed in the World Top 100. I was one of them, but it was definitely not the tier for the Guardian special of just being extremely tanky and hard to kill. I thought that was going to be valuable this tier, but it was not really. So that was a bad decision for me, both in the tier list making and in choosing what to play for my guild. Other specs as well, like Vengeance, probably should have been down in B also. Vengeance actually the least represented tank so far from what I can see among top kills. It's really not that bad. I've played some Vengeance for some other, you know, some on an alt for a bit of content, and it really isn't that bad, but every guild's got a Havoc, so it's not bringing that buff anymore. And there's not really anything you can abuse the mobility of the Vengeance Demon Hunter to get done. It looked like for a bit in PTR testing there maybe was. There were some spots where you could do some cool stuff with, like, leaping around, and, you know, on Sylvanas, like, clearing all the platforms really fast and being resilient to that magic damage while you're by yourself and picking up all those stacks. But turns out that, you know, monks can do that too. Even Death Knights can waddle around and do the job on that fight to some extent. So anyways, that was my tier list. The biggest misses of this tier list were Enhancement Shaman. That, I think, is the only one that I was multiple tiers off on. And Shadow, but Shadow got nerfed. I think I was probably only one tier off on Shadow if it hadn't gotten nerfed. The other specs, I'm largely happy with where I placed them. Maybe Subtlety should have been 2 tiers up as well. Everything else, though, within a tier of where I think it should have been, which, yeah, I'm pretty happy with this result. You know, you'll see some tier lists have had to update by 3 or 4 tiers, which specs were in which tier. But for the most part, I was able to avoid that fate. So, yeah, pretty happy with how this one went. Excited to do it again for next tier. We'll see how well predictions change. Again, the 3rd tier in a row where I put Shadow higher than it should have been, so maybe I'll figure out that Shadow's not actually that sick this time, but we'll see. There will be an M+ version of this where I will look at my M+ version of this video, probably at some point in the next couple months. M+ takes a little bit longer to have the metagame really coalesce than the raid metagame does. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. I thought it was fun to make the original predictions and this video. And okay, so funny story. I paused this video. This is the video of me doing the original tier list before I had actually rated the Warlock specs. And then I forgot about it, and then I was almost uploaded this video without talking about my ratings of Warlocks, which would have been bad. So I'm now adding this bit at the end where we'll talk about how I did with the Warlock specs. I put both Demo and Destro up in A and Affliction down in B. Affliction really didn't show up for anything this tier, but honestly it could have. If there were fights that were oriented more around burst AoE, and if the Windwalkers in most guilds couldn't cover that niche as fully as they did, I think Affliction would have actually been a pretty solid choice for that damage profile. However, things ended up much as I expected, which was Destruction for fights where there were multiple targets, and Demonology for fights where focusing single target damage was the most important thing, especially when Power Infusion was available. One neat interaction that I missed was the interaction between Demonology and Blood Death Knight, where there's this Blood Death Knight legendary that amps the health of your party when you use your Vamp Blood. And that actually is a pretty big damage scaler for Demonology Warlocks. So a couple guilds were making use of that synergy to make their Demo Locks deal a lot of damage in conjunction with, the Power Infusions and stuff being funneled towards them as well. The Rally also from a Warrior, which is a pretty cool little trick you can do for some more damage. Ended up being that Demonology wasn't like insane hard carrying the tier or anything, but you did see it on several fights, including from Sylvanas. Actually, both of these specs saw play fairly early in kills on Sylvanas, with Warlocks choosing between the two based on whether they wanted to prioritize that Phase 3 Sylvanas damage or good damage on the Phase 2 intermission. So a lot of different value for the multiple different Warlock specs, sort of similar to Mage, except the Warlocks didn't have to pick in advance because the same Covenant was good for all three of their specs, whereas the Mage kind of had to promise which spec they were going to play, and you could swap once during progression, right? But you couldn't swap back, and so you saw most Mages kind of commit to something at some point and stay with that, whereas Warlocks got to experiment and play around with different specs, which is pretty fun and cool, and I look forward to an expansion where everybody gets to do that again. Anyways, hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.